what we're going to focus on today is building client champions. Few of you joined the last training which we did, which was actually focused on how do we know what a champion is? And I think this is a term that we use very loosely in sales, even just like a blocker, right? There's these terms that we use all the time, but we don't always discuss what actually makes up a champion. So anyone who was on the training last time or any idea what actually makes a champion, there's 3 core criteria. Vinny, do you remember? Anyone have any guesses? My normal crickets aren't working. I know this crowd is usually very vocal, so I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. Say it's a rough Monday. Is that fair? You'll let you slide on this one.
Yeah, very rough Monday.
I know. I was like, I feel like it's not even like, there's usually one person who's having one of those days. We'll just agree this is one of those days. So yeah, don't worry.
Number one, no, yeah. I'll throw a quality in for you, Megan. The champion should be able to introduce you to the right people within the organization.
Yeah. So we call that power and influence. So being able, they not only have access to those higher level stakeholders, but they also introduce us. So definitely a lot of what Jose was just mentioning in terms of recommending us and introducing us to whether it's higher level stakeholders in one deal or, stakeholders within a different organization, different company, et cetera. But this person should also simply have influence over the decisions or as well or influence over the decision makers. The second is that they have to have some skin in the game. They have to have a personal win where your win is their win and your loss is also their loss. So this really relates to what we were talking about with Jose's deal, where I'm like, if we're struggling, we should go to the champion because that also means that they're struggling. And finally, I feel like this is the one that most people think of when they think of a champion, which is they need to be able and willing to sell for us internally. That can mean on a very easy basis. It could mean that they're supportive of us, that they tell other people about us, they answer questions internally, but also smaller things like they could help us project manage and drive urgency. And even just give us that competitive intel. So that's why we did spend a little bit more time on Jose's, where we're even asking the champion to share, hey, can you tell us a little bit more about where your team is at, what questions and objections they have, and how can we actually, and also asking them to help us progress the deal. So a few questions that came up in the last training were, okay, what do you do when you have a champion who won't connect you to other stakeholders? How do you test someone's level of power? It's a little bit tricky, right? How do you identify and build personal wins? I think that was yours, Binu. And how do you encourage them to connect you to the right people? So we are going to spend a little bit more time today on not figuring out how to test and qualify a champion, but once you feel like you have someone who has the potential to be a champion, how do you actually enable them and leverage them? So when you think about building stronger champions, I want you to think about it in this way. Instead of feeling like you're selling to your champions, right? We're presenting to them, we're sending them pricing. I want you to think about you and them on a team. And there's essentially 2 teams outside of you, right? It's a nice Venn diagram. On one side, there's you and your team and everyone at your company that you're kind of working against in some ways, right? And then there's also, you could even say like your investors, right? It's your investors that want you to have favorable payment terms, right? So leveraging some othering strategies. As well as their team, right? So their stakeholders, the people who could veto, partners, or any of those like tricky late stage stakeholders. This could be anyone from InfoSec and security to they're a team that's more technical and has a lot of questions. If you consider yourself on a team with your champion, how can you work with them to enable them to buy from you versus feeling an adversarial approach? So thinking through, I want to just give you 3 easy ways to think about this. So the first one, in terms of building a personal win, so this directly answers that question of like, I've never uncovered personal wins of my champions. How do I do that? Any ideas? Anyone want to share really quickly? No. So a few ways here. Just a very easy question, find their why. So especially after we come out of discovery, we may have a lot, whether we're in discovery or we're even deepening discovery, simply asking this question of, hey, I've heard a lot about what the team is looking to do and what the organizational goals are at a very high level. But I'm curious, what does this project mean to you? The second one is knowing that like by even going through the sales process and evaluating all of their options, we're also helping them work towards accomplishing their pains and their gains. So one thing I really like is I actually have an entire slide in my proposal deck that's dedicated to what could go wrong. Why that is valuable is because I know that my champions are probably the ones that have already tried a lot of things. So even before I talk to them about the pricing and what that could look like, I have a slide that says, hey, here are the 5 main reasons why, even with the smartest trainers and the people working on the ground, even if you've tried a lot of things, these are the 5 things, the 5 reasons why this could not work. And this actually has turned clients around for me. And I see it because I might have someone who's a little bit disengaged. And then when I show them those 5 reasons, they're like, okay, back up a minute. I cannot get my head wrapped around the second one. I struggle with this so much. What advice would you have for me? That is a moment that turns a champion, or turns probably more of a coach or a supporter into a true champion. Even asking, for you, what's worked and what's not worked. Even teaching them something in the sales process for free can be an incredible way to get someone on your side, show some value. And it doesn't have to be, providing free services. It can even just be teaching, educating, and giving them industry-wide knowledge. The third, Jose, this is a big one that we've covered, is asking for their perspective. So I'm curious, going into this next meeting, I know there's going to be a lot of pressure. Can we just talk really quickly? What worries you? What do you think could go wrong? This is such a funny question because we're so worried all the time as salespeople and founders and whatever your roles are about having all of the answers. And we forget that there's people on the other side that want this just as much as you do if we've built a champion. So it can be really insightful to ask them what they're worried about. And for me, I even say, hey, these are the 3 things I'm worried about because I've seen deals fall apart at this stage. So we'll talk about that in a minute. The second one, in terms of enabling their power and influence, this is a weird one because a lot of times we think about testing this. We're like, if they're not giving us access to economic buyers, then they're not a true champion. I used to have this team that I trained, and they're like, they would almost like get their pitchforks and they're like, fake champion, fake champion. I want you to think about it differently. And I want to ask you, how can we actually influence their willingness to connect us to other people? Why do you think that they're hesitant to connect a salesperson with their boss or their boss's boss? Any ideas?
I think when they are not convinced themselves, maybe they want to get those pointers, those boxes checked before, they would put us through to the other stakeholders, probably then.
Brilliant. They don't trust us themselves. So why would they connect us to those higher level stakeholders? Absolutely. Alec, any other ideas?
Or maybe they, it's maybe not necessarily they don't trust you, but they just don't want to risk themselves looking bad, right?
Exactly. And that was a big one, because maybe even though they feel confident and with us, they like us, they trust us, maybe they're just nervous about how that could go, or they want more control. So there are a few ways that we can help overcome this. And a lot of it just starts with helping them map that value. I work with a lot of people. A lot of times my champions, they don't always tell me the high level. So a lot of times I work with the people I start with it could be the head of enablement for more of my like bigger clients that have already IPO'd. They have an enablement team of like 6 people. A lot of times my champion is the head of enablement. And one of the things I tell them is like, hey, no matter if it's me or you, we're going to have to sell this to the CRO. Let's look at this summary of everything you've told me in terms of the gains and the pains and what you're struggling with and trying to accomplish. And let's make sure that we map it to that person's initiatives. That is one of the most important exercises you can do. And they might struggle with it. But if you don't do that, then they're going to struggle with it no matter if you're in the room or not. So this is a really valuable way of making sure that you help them have that C-level conversation. Because if no matter if it's us or them, if we're trying to pitch to a C-level conversation with user level metrics and goals and pain points, it's going to fall flat anyway. So there's a really important aspect of making sure that we're talking in the level of power and influence at the highest levels throughout the entire conversation and helping them tell us the right things. The more direct one as well could simply be, hey, typically at this point, it's really helpful for us to bring in a few different types of stakeholders. So for example, moving into the demo, it really helps if we can bring in some more technical resources. A lot of times they come in later in this process and we actually have to bring them back. We have to move backwards, right? They want to see the demo, they have some technical questions. So it really does help to make sure that they're involved early. I'm curious, how do you feel about that? What would you want to see in order to bring them in? And, Bina mentions like they might have some objections or questions. So even just, I think a lot of us stop when they're like, no, we don't need them to come in at this point. If we actually just ask another question or two, it can be really helpful. Saying, hey, that's totally fair. Tell me a little bit more about what you think that they would want to see so that we can even highlight that in the demo. Or when do you think it would make sense to bring them in? And what would you like to see happen before you feel comfortable making that introduction and bringing them in? Does anyone, do we always ask those questions?
No. Yeah.
I'm very guilty of being like, you don't want to bring them in? Okay. So even just asking another question helps.
Yeah, exactly. Totally. Yeah.
Yeah. And you're gonna, every call is going to be a little bit different, but it's ironic to me because as I've asked more of these questions, it actually is much less awkward than just all the questions that are going through your head, right?
Yeah,
so it's really good. A lot of times their client's answer is simple. It could be as simple as like, oh, they're actually on vacation next week. So I can't even bring them in, right? Or it could be, hey, this person's really busy right now. I want to make sure that by the time we actually have a demo with them, I'm more confident in the demo and I see it first so that I can even answer some of the questions that they'll have. So even asking the question can be really good. I love that question of what would you want to have happen before you feel comfortable bringing them in? It's a really easy one. And the last one is sell for you internally. So I think a lot of times we leave it up to them to do this. I'm guilty of it as well, but I want you to get a bit more proactive. So the first thing I like to do is to recommend collaborating with them. So this one is, let's say that you do have, for example, sometimes pricing or demo is the first time that we have multiple stakeholders on the call. I personally do not like to just like leave it to be like, yeah, I'm just going to figure it out on the call. I love to collaborate with my champion in advance. And I'm like, hey, I know that the next call, we have some more stakeholders on. I want to make sure that we both look really good. And as I've been building out the content, I just have a few questions that I want to review with you in advance so that we make sure that it makes a great impression. Could we walk through it together? I've literally done this with pricing where the champion sees my pricing before other stakeholders. One champion literally told me to increase my pricing because we kind of talked about the competitive state and everything that like he was seeing in the field. This can be incredibly important. And it could also just be a 15-minute call, a 30-minute call. But by asking like what could go wrong, who's going to be included, what will they want to see, it also helps you strengthen each and every call, dramatically increase your conversion rates, and make sure that your champion's really aligned with you and doesn't turn into a blocker. And finally, prepare them. So thinking through, here are the main 3 challenges at this stage. How comfortable do you feel with this? Now, this is interesting because it could actually be, so there's a few moments where I use this. It could be that, let's say we're in demo. So Jose, let's say we're on your call, right? And that demo call that you had where, I know you weren't on it, but let's say that we are preparing for that demo and we're like, hey, the 3 things that usually go wrong at this stage. The first one is that I want to make sure we have a very clear understanding of what they would want to see in terms of what their goals are, what their pain points are, so that we can tailor the demo to those things. And the one thing I'm a little bit nervous about is that we haven't met this team yet. So I don't know if we have enough information. Would it actually make more sense to perhaps slow down a bit and to have a conversation with them, even if it's, meeting in the middle? We could even just spend like the first 15 minutes going into some deeper discovery. How would you feel about that? And giving them some of those, some of the things that could go wrong. So for example, another one is in the proposal stage. I always tell people, I'm like, hey, normally you're going to have to present this pricing to a few other people whether it's behind the scenes or on the call. You're going to have to answer questions. Normally the 3 questions you're going to have to answer are how much, how soon, and how sure. They're going to ask you how much time, resources, and value will this provide? How sure are you of the results? And how soon will we see value, and how soon will we be able to implement this? How do you feel answering those questions? And how can I support you in that? That is actually the how soon, how sure, and how much is actually a quick preview for you of the economic buyer training. But if you share whatever you're anxious about and then work with them on a strategy to handle those, it's actually really helpful, because we forget a lot of the times, how hard selling is. Imagine having to sell something internally as a non-seller. We forget that a lot of times, unless you're me or Scott, we don't sell to salespeople, right? So it's really hard to treat our champions and to expect them to sell internally without any support. And from my experience, if I ask them, hey, do you want help selling this? They're like, no, we got it. Don't worry. It's fine. But if I actually say, hey, here are a few things you might be worried about, or you might want to worry about, and here are some things that I actually have already. So one, Jose, this is a great one you mentioned. Hey, a lot of times they're going to want to know, who else do you work with? They're going to ask you, how sure are you? Do they work with other clients in our industry? So one thing I was thinking about is recommending a client reference. How do you feel about that? I have someone who's actually your size who has some very similar challenges and who might be a really good reference for you. How would you feel about me recommending that? So getting more proactive and prescriptive with the preparation and help versus asking the dreaded question of, do you need me to help with that? Most of the time they're like, no, I got it. So I knew I just threw a lot at you. In terms of these 3 questions, where do you think that you need the most work? Is it uncovering their personal win? Is it enabling them to connect you with more senior stakeholders? Or is it getting really proactive and prescriptive with helping them sell for you internally?
I think for me, in between the power and influence, and then, the questions that you ask them, when they are actually going back to the stakeholders, at that point of time, that those cracking questions that you ask them, that, what exactly would they be looking for in case if we come on a demo call next time, and when everybody is all around, and then, just proactively preparing that call. I think that would be a big one for me. Yeah.
And you see how these work together really nicely as well, because let's say that they're like, hey, this person normally never meets with vendors. The process is typically for me to present them to them. So even if they're like, okay, I get it, you're going to be presenting this to them, we can still support them in what they need to do to sell for you internally. And I've done this. I literally am like, hey, so it sounds like you're going to have a big meeting coming up, right? What can I do? Like, I actually have a few slides that I can help you with. Would you want to do the deck together at least? You'd be surprised how they're like, oh my goodness, you would do that? And I'm like, yeah, this is my job. I'm a salesperson, right? So it really helps. Anyone else? Any big takeaways or things that areas you want to focus?
I mean, in my experience, the most challenging part has usually been enabling them or getting them to introduce you to the right people in in higher places, basically.
Yeah. And I'm curious, where did you find any of the ideas helpful in terms of like even, speaking in the higher level language, or asking them what it would take, like what would they need in order to introduce you? Have you ever tried any of those?
Yeah, no. And I mean, I've had them before, and I've worked with them, and I've sort of prepared them and given them materials and whatever, but in general terms, that's been the most challenging part.
And go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that so depending on the size of the organization and where you have to be, and especially, I mean, I'm thinking of one in particular where I was working with this guy recently, actually, and the thing is that we needed the project to advance to several different areas at the same time, right? Because the decision making was kind of spread around. So I found that to be challenging for sure.
Yeah, and I feel this one because honestly, I think it's the hardest one, because enabling them to sell for us is both easier. They're more willing to do it, to not bring us in and to present internally instead. And even a personal win, I feel like it's something that we don't always do, but we can still win deals without personal wins. It just strengthens it. But the power and influence piece is, as you mentioned, is often the hardest. And it's also the most important.